Hi, I'm Jess Bradford. I'm a visual artist. I'm working in ceramics, painting, installation, and video. I was born in Singapore and I lived there till I was around about 18. And then I came here to pursue an arts degree, and I never really left. I am I come from mixed heritage. I'm Singaporean, Chinese, and Australian, Caucasian Australian. And when I was growing up, that was always like a bit of like a point of contention for me. I'm very white passing, so people always assumed I was an expat. And weirdly enough, I felt more comfortable in Sydney, where people wouldn't ask me where I was from, surprisingly, versus in Singapore where they always would. So a lot of my practice actually deals with my mixed heritage and this kind of ambivalent connection to Chinese culture I have, because growing up in a mixed household as well, my mom was a bit like, "No, I don't want to teach you all this Chinese stuff. It's like all this old-fashioned stuff. Like, let's just focus on like Western things." Because she was also of the mind that like she's like I think economically speaking, like it'll be better if you just pretend you're fully white. So yeah, it was always like a very difficult relationship for me, like my relationship to my own heritage. Where I grew up in Singapore, actually just around the back of the hill, was this theme park that my mom would always take me to, and it was a Chinese cultural theme park called Haw Villa or Tiger Balm Gardens. And it is this really wacky, crazy place full of dioramas and sculptures of Chinese culture and Chinese storage. A lot of it like more folk related, and that classic mixture of like Buddhist and Taoist beliefs. So Haw Villa is really important to me because it kind of deals with that point of contention. Like it's a big part of my childhood. I really remember it as some of my early memories, and it's very weird and disturbing space. And I feel a lot of connection to it. And as a very idiosyncratic space, it's like one of those weird things that like a lot of Singaporeans are connected to, like of my era or slightly before. Something that's like very surprisingly Singaporean versus like, elsewhere. But at the same time, I don't know any of the specifics about the stories that the place represented. So, because like my mom didn't, like either she didn't know or she didn't teach me, kind of a bit of both, really. And even in the period of time when it was built, the 1930s, the guys who built it, who were like rich tycoons from like the Tiger Balm medicated oil business, were like, oh, Singaporeans becoming too, cosmopolitan and everyone's forgetting their cultural roots. So like it's a really funny space because I think that that dialogue of like how do we remember our heritage, like who are we, especially as people who are in like a multicultural or transcultural context, who are migrants, like the Chinese were not local to the area, they migrated there, like kind of like more like you'd say indigenous Malay population was there prior. So a lot of the things that I'm personally dealing with, like I feel like the site is sort of involved with as well. So it becomes this weird place where I can talk about these larger issues, and I can place myself in that dialogue. And yeah, and so a lot of my work deals with that. I deal a lot with fan photography, and I like repaint it. A lot of my process is about replicating things that are already there. And it's both this kind of homage to something, but also trying to understand it. I think a lot of people who deal with this conflicted relationship to their own culture talk about authenticity and reproduction, and like a lot of that comes through in a material sense in their practice. And I definitely feel like it's there in mine. For the works that are actually currently on show, a lot of them are my ceramics. So um, what I found really interesting was that in my previous practices, I've always been interested in photography, but with this project, because I could physically visit the site still, like, and it's such a physical experience, like it's a really amazing 3D thing that you can move around. Like I wanted to do something more than just 2D work. So all the ceramics I make are based off photographs I take of the site myself, not fan photographs that I'm purchasing. And so I go to Singapore, I take the photographs, I bring the photographs back, and then I try create a 3D object from a 2D image. And like a lot of that discussion about like, what gets lost in that, and like how much is my imagination and how much is actually there. And I haven't fully, it's like one of those things where I'm like, I really 100% believe this, but I don't have the sources to back it up. But how they've created like the fake rockeries and shapes in Hoppervilla, I feel like it's one of those weird mishmashes that exist in kind of a lot of other traditional Chinese cultural production, where like paintings were kind of based off nature, and then garden construction was sort of based off paintings of nature, and then paintings of those gardens were made, and then more gardens were made specifically referring to the. There was like a lot of like wish wash back and forth. So the rockscape and the mountainscape in Hoppervilla is highly fantastical. It's not there to replicate necessarily a real environment, more like the idea of environment. And like I found that really fascinating, because obviously like a lot of culture, like cultural stories, are actually specifically geographical. And part of like this whole question around heritage and like what gets lost and what gets retained, like I often think about it in, or I'm starting to think about it in specific geographic terms, you know. Like what is the idea of a tiger in Australia, where like we don't have any tigers, like it becomes this mythical object that has the same space as a dragon effectively, even though like dragons don't exist everywhere. So yeah, I was really interested in replicating those mountainscapes as well, to kind of, yeah, start dealing with like like those earlier questions of like where you belong, or where culture physically belongs, or like how you bring those aspects with you, like how you describe space around you, and how that gets kind of like weirdly mutated as well. So like people who were making the idea of mountains and painting the idea of Chinese mountains, but in Singapore, like, did they know what they were doing? Like, because the place has been repainted so many times as well. Like originally the rock face was mostly brown, and then at one point they painted it all blue, and then at another point they've painted back to like purple. Like just even that I think is really, really fascinating. Again, these ideas of like how do we represent something kind of like on a simple level. And like, those simple levels, those simple aesthetic choices are like what reflect themselves in my art practice. So surprisingly, a lot of the ceramics are quite pale for me. They are the bisque ceramics. So that's, a lot of them haven't been taken to the final fire. They're like very fragile, temporary objects, and they kind of have spots of color. And it's referring to that point in time where like, actually, whenever they repaint everything, rather than like doing touch-ups, they just paint everything white, and then they just go over the top of it again. So yeah, there's lots of things that are dealing with like literally the physical aspects of the part, but like, touching base with some of those like larger questions, and that are still developing even for me.